On a winter morning when the mountains of Frosthaven were buried under endless snow, a police officer named Elias almost drove away from a frozen parking lot and never knew how close he came to losing everything that would soon save him. He was not looking for a miracle that day. He was not looking for love. He was only finishing his shift when he saw something in the snow that should not have been there. A tiny German Shepherd puppy left behind in the cold. What happened next changed two lives forever. This is not just a rescue story. It is a story about second chances and the quiet power of choosing to stay when the world tells you to walk away. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from and leave your city in the comments, because this story is for anyone who still believes in hope. Frosthaven, Colorado, late December. The storm had finally loosened its grip on the mountains after 3 nights of relentless snow, leaving the small town buried under a white hush that muffled every sound except the wind sighing through pine branches and the distant creak of frozen roofs. Streetlights glowed like tired sentinels along the empty roads. The Alpine Mart shopping complex on the north edge of town had been closed for 2 days, its wide parking lot abandoned, erased into a pale desert of wind-sculpted drifts and frozen tire tracks. This was the kind of morning that made the world feel paused, as if winter itself were holding its breath. Officer Elias Mercer, 43 years old, drove slowly across the lot in his black and white patrol vehicle, heater humming low, windshield wipers knocking away the last flakes. Elias was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark brown hair already threaded with gray at the temples, a scar faintly cutting across his right eyebrow from a bar fight in his early 20s, and eyes the color of cold river water, steady, observant, and burdened with the quiet weight of years on duty. The townspeople of Frosthaven knew him as dependable, reserved, and deeply patient, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke, the kind who never laughed loudly but smiled with his eyes when children waved at his cruiser. Years ago, a fatal winter highway accident involving his younger brother had shaped the careful way he approached both life and people. Since then, Elias carried himself with the restraint of someone who understood how quickly everything could vanish. He was finishing his perimeter check when he noticed something that didn't belong in the flawless geometry of snow. Near the far edge of the lot, half buried against a frozen shopping cart return, lay a crooked metal cart turned sideways by the wind. A dark shape clung to it, no bigger than a bundle of rags. Elias slowed, frowning. He eased the cruiser forward, tires crunching softly over ice, then stopped and stepped out into the cold. The wind cut through his uniform, and he pulled his coat tighter as he approached. Under a sheet of soaked cardboard and a thin jacket that might once have been navy blue, something moved. A German Shepherd puppy, female, no more than 4 months old, black and tan coat dulled by grime and frost, ribs visible beneath her fur like the framework of a fragile ship. Her small body trembled so violently that the cardboard above her rattled. Electrical wire looped around her neck and tied her to the metal cart. Her front paws were wrapped clumsily in layers of adhesive tape, the skin beneath red and raw where frostbite had begun to bloom. Her eyes, large, dark, impossibly alive, lifted and met his. No bark, no whine, just a steady, exhausted gaze that seemed far older than her tiny body. A piece of paper hung from the cart handle, smeared and wet from melting snow. On it, written in uneven black marker, was a single word: Lyra. Elias stood there longer than he realized. He had seen many things in his career: wrecked cars, shattered families, broken men. He had seen neglect, cruelty, and loss. But this small, silent creature bound to cold steel in the middle of a storm's aftermath, hit him somewhere he hadn't expected. He took a step back. His radio crackled softly on his shoulder. He had other calls to answer, roads to check, people to help. The voice of discipline, sharpened by years in uniform, urged him to move on. Someone else would deal with it. Animal control. The shelter. Procedures existed for a reason. Elias turned and walked back toward his cruiser. He reached the driver's door. Then, in the side mirror, he saw her again. The puppy had shifted just enough that her face was visible through the fluttering cardboard. Snowflakes clung to her lashes. Her chest rose in shallow, uneven pulls. Her eyes locked on his reflection, steady and unblinking. There was no accusation in them, only a quiet, impossible question. If you leave, who remains? Elias closed his eyes once, slowly. He exhaled a breath that fogged the glass, and he turned back. He radioed dispatch with controlled urgency, reporting an abandoned animal in critical condition, requesting animal control and a rescue unit. Then he crouched beside the cart. Up close, Lyra smelled of cold fur, metal, and fear. Her ears flattened, but she did not growl. She did not snap. She only trembled harder. "It's okay," Elias murmured, his voice low and steady, the same tone he used when calming frightened victims at accident scenes. "I've got you." He retrieved the wire cutters from his trunk and knelt in the snow. The metal wire was stiff with ice. His gloved hands worked carefully, the snip echoing too loud in the stillness. The moment the wire fell away, Lyra sagged, as if the last thing holding her upright had been cut. Elias slipped his coat open and wrapped it around her thin body. She weighed almost nothing. He could feel her heartbeat, erratic and weak, fluttering against his palm like a trapped bird. He lifted her and carried her to the cruiser, laying her across the back seat, cranking the heater to full blast. The windshield filled with fog as warmth returned to the air. Lyra shuddered, her breath hitching, her paws twitching under the tape. Elias pressed a hand to her side, counting her breaths, the way he had been taught long ago in emergency training. Too slow, too shallow. "Hold on," he whispered, more to himself than to her. Snow began falling again, light but persistent, as he pulled out of the lot and headed towards Summit Valley Emergency Veterinary Center, the only clinic within 40 miles equipped for winter trauma. The town blurred past dark storefronts, silent houses, trees bent under snow. Frosthaven looked like a ghost village wrapped in cotton. The road beyond town climbed sharply, coated in ice. The cruiser slid once, then caught. Elias's knuckles whitened on the wheel. In the back seat, Lyra's eyes fluttered closed. No, stay with me," Elias said, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. He reached back, his hand brushing her chest through the coat, feeling the fragile thump of her heart. He did not realize until much later that he was speaking her name out loud. "Lyra! Come on, Lyra!" When he reached the clinic, its lights glowed like a harbor in the storm. He burst through the doors, carrying her in his arms, snow trailing behind him. The waiting area was nearly empty except for a middle-aged woman named Ruth Calder, a short, sturdy librarian from town with silver hair pulled into a bun and a face shaped by both kindness and loss. Her elderly golden retriever lay beside her, breathing heavily. She watched Elias pass with silent concern. A veterinary technician named Noah Briggs, a thin young man in his 20s with wire-rimmed glasses and nervous energy, rushed forward and took Lyra from Elias's arms. A veterinarian, Dr. Hannah Klein, mid-30s, tall, composed, auburn hair tucked under a surgical cap, eyes sharp with focus, appeared moments later and guided the puppy through swinging doors. Elias was left standing in the lobby, his coat empty, his hands trembling, snow melting onto the tile. Behind the doors, Lyra vanished into light and sound and motion. Elias sank into a chair, breathing hard, heart still racing, unaware that in the span of less than an hour, the course of his life had already begun to change. The snow had thickened again by the time Elias Mercer stepped back outside the emergency veterinary center. Night had settled fully over Frosthaven, wrapping the mountains in a blue-black stillness that felt heavy, as though the world itself were holding something fragile in its hands. The wind rolled in slow waves across the frozen parking lot, carrying the scent of pine sap and distant wood smoke. Elias stood there for a moment, his breath rising in clouds, staring at the glass doors behind him, knowing that on the other side of that barrier, a tiny life was balanced on a blade's edge. Inside, Lyra lay beneath heated blankets, wires and tubes surrounding her slight frame. Her body temperature had been dangerously low when she arrived, her blood sugar almost non-existent. Dr. Hannah Klein moved with brisk precision, her auburn hair tucked neatly under her surgical cap, her expression focused but not unkind. She was the sort of veterinarian who had chosen this mountain post because she believed that small towns deserved excellent medicine too. Years earlier, she had lost her own shepherd to a winter accident on the pass, and since then she treated every animal as if it were a debt she owed the world. When Elias had tried to ask how bad it was, she had simply met his eyes and said, "We're doing everything we can. The next few hours matter more than anything." Elias nodded, though the words felt thin and useless compared to the storm in his chest. He filled out the intake forms with hands that no longer quite obeyed him. Under owner, he left the line blank. Under found by, he wrote his name and badge number. When the receptionist, a quiet woman named Marjorie Lowe with pale freckles and a gentle voice, asked if he wished to remain as the point of contact, Elias hesitated only long enough to realize the question had already been answered by the way he hadn't left. "Yes," he said. "Yes." "I'll stay." Hours slipped past in the waiting room. The clock above the reception desk ticked with infuriating calm. At one point, Ruth Calder, the librarian Elias had seen earlier, approached him, her silver hair escaping its bun. She handed him a paper cup of coffee. "You look like you could use this," she said softly. Her golden retriever, Amos, lay curled at her feet, old and tired, but alive. Elias thanked her, barely tasting the bitterness as he drank. He found himself watching the double doors over and over, as though staring hard enough might will them to open with good news. Sometime after midnight, the wind outside intensified, rattling the building. Elias rose and stepped outside to call animal control. The road was nearly impassable now, the storm returning with teeth. The dispatcher promised that an officer would come as soon as conditions allowed. Elias leaned against the cold brick wall, phone pressed to his ear, staring up at the swirling sky. He had crossed a line he'd spent years carefully maintaining. He had stepped beyond duty and into something far more dangerous caring. When he returned inside, Dr. Klein was waiting. "She's stable for the moment," the veterinarian said. "But barely. Severe hypothermia, dehydration, frostbite on the pads, and her blood sugar is still frighteningly low. We're warming her slowly. Too fast could kill her. She's fighting, though." She paused, then added, "She's tougher than she looks." Elias swallowed. "Can I see her?" Dr. Klein nodded. She led him through the treatment area. Machines beeped softly, their rhythm strangely comforting. Lyra lay in a clear oxygen chamber, wrapped in silver thermal blankets. Her fur was matted, her ears too large for her thin head, her chest rising and falling in shallow movements. A small IV line ran into her shaved foreleg. Elias's breath caught. He had faced blizzards, accidents, and death without flinching, yet the sight of this tiny creature broke something open inside him. He placed his hand gently against the chamber. "You're not alone," he murmured. The words felt foolish, but they were true. The night stretched on. Elias dozed in the chair only in brief, uneasy fragments, waking each time the wind howled or a door opened. Around 3 in the morning, he heard it. A thin, fragile sound, barely more than a whisper. Dr. Klein hurried past him. Moments later, she returned, eyes bright with cautious hope. "She vocalized," she said. "It's a good sign." Elias pressed his palms together, head bowed. He did not pray often, but he did then. Dawn came slowly, pale and cold. Frosthaven emerged from the darkness in shades of blue and silver. Elias had not left the building. When the sun finally crept over the mountains, Dr. Klein approached him again. "She made it through the night," she said. "That doesn't mean she's safe, but it means she has a chance." Relief flooded him so hard his knees nearly gave out. He thanked her, his voice hoarse. By late morning, animal control finally arrived. The officer, a stocky man named Peter Lawson, with a thick beard and eyes worn by winter patrols, listened as Elias explained the situation. "We'll open an abandonment case," Lawson said. "She'll need a foster placement once she's stable. Shelter's overwhelmed. Rescues are stretched thin with this storm." Elias stared at Lyra through the glass again. He had not planned this. He had never wanted a pet, never allowed himself the luxury of attachment since his brother's death. His cabin was quiet, orderly, empty. He was a man who believed in distance. "I can foster her," he said. Lawson raised an eyebrow. "You sure, officer? This isn't a weekend job. Puppies in this condition need constant care." Elias did not look away. "I'm sure." The paperwork was drawn up that afternoon. Temporary foster care, 21 days minimum, with veterinary supervision. Elias signed without hesitation. The pen felt heavy in his hand, as though he were signing something far larger than a form. Dr. Klein reviewed the care instructions with him in detail. She'll need warmth, hydration by syringe, tiny feedings every 2 hours. No stress, no cold. If her temperature drops or she stops eating, you bring her back immediately." He listened to every word, memorizing them like coordinates on a map. By evening, Lyra was stable enough to leave the clinic. Wrapped in blankets, she was placed carefully in his arms. She weighed almost nothing. Her heartbeat fluttered against his chest. Elias carried her through the falling snow, every step deliberate, as though the world might shatter if he moved too quickly. When he reached his cabin at the edge of town, the fire was the first thing he lit, the small room filled with warmth and flickering gold. He laid Lyra on a blanket near the hearth. She stirred, her nose twitching. Elias knelt beside her. "This is home for now," he whispered. "We'll figure it out." Outside, the wind pressed against the walls. Inside, a man and a fragile life breathed in the same space, bound by a choice neither had expected. The first night in Elias Mercer's cabin passed like a long, fragile prayer that refused to end. Outside, the storm returned before midnight, snow sliding from the black sky and heavy curtains that erased the narrow road and the dark outline of the forest beyond. Wind clawed at the walls as if winter itself were trying to reclaim what he had taken from its grip. Inside, the cabin glowed with the soft gold of firelight, the only steady thing in a world of cold motion. Lyra lay on a folded wool blanket near the hearth, her small body bundled in 2 towels and Elias's spare flannel shirt. She was conscious, but barely. Her eyes followed him when he moved, dark and glassy with exhaustion. Her breathing came in uneven whispers, her ribs lifting with visible effort. Elias crouched beside her, checking the thermometer Dr. Klein had taped to her crate. The number wavered just above the danger line. Not good, but not gone. Elias prepared the syringe exactly as he had been shown, warming the electrolyte mixture between his palms until it was no longer cold. He slid the tip gently between Lyra's lips. She resisted weakly at first, then swallowed. 1 drop, 2, 3. He counted every swallow like a heartbeat. "Easy, girl," he murmured. His voice was steady, but his hands shook. He had spent years keeping himself contained, carefully balanced between the world and whatever storms he carried inside. But in that moment, with the fire popping softly and the snow pressing against the windows, the careful order of his life unraveled into something raw and frightening and achingly tender. The cabin was not prepared for this. There was no dog bed, no bowls, no crate. Only a man who knew how to stop bleeding, redirect traffic, and hold dying hands at accident scenes, now sitting on the floor at 2 a.m. praying a 4-month-old puppy would keep breathing. Lyra shuddered once, a faint tremor passing through her body. Elias reached out and laid his palm against her side, feeling the flutter of her heart. Still there. He did not sleep. When dawn crept through the frosted windows, pale and thin, Elias was still on the floor beside her. His eyes burned with exhaustion. The fire had faded to embers. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and medicine. Lyra was alive. She had not improved much, but she had not slipped either. The thermometer held steady. Her breathing remained shallow but consistent. She had taken nearly a full syringe of fluids through the night. Elias rose carefully, joints stiff, and brewed coffee he barely touched. He phoned the clinic the moment they opened. Dr. Klein listened as he reported every detail, from Lyra's temperature to the rhythm of her breathing to the slight twitch in her back paw. "You're doing well," the veterinarian told him. "Bring her in this afternoon for blood work. Until then, keep her warm and hydrated. Every hour matters. Every hour." By midday, the wind softened. The storm loosened its grip, leaving the mountains wrapped in a hush so deep Elias could hear snow falling from the eaves. He bundled Lyra again, placed her carefully in the back seat of the cruiser, and drove the slow road back into town. At the clinic, Lyra was examined, weighed, tested. Still dangerously thin, still weak, still alive. Dr. Klein met his eyes. "She wants to live," she said, "but she needs your help." That night back at the cabin, the first true sign of hope arrived without announcement. Lyra lifted her head. It was only an inch, perhaps less, but she held it there, trembling, as if the simple act were an act of defiance against everything that had nearly taken her. Elias's breath caught. He knelt closer. "That's it," he whispered. "That's my girl. She did not collapse immediately. Her eyes focused on him, the fog inside them thinning just enough for him to see something new. Curiosity, faint but unmistakable. By the third day, she could swallow food mixed thin with warm water. By the fourth, she shifted her paws beneath herself. By the fifth, she tried to stand. She failed. Her legs buckled. She fell sideways with a soft, breathless sound. Elias was there in an instant, lifting her carefully, settling her back on the blanket. "It's okay," he said. "We're not racing anyone." She tried again that evening, and again the next morning. On the seventh day, Lyra stood. Not for long, not steadily, but she stood. Outside, the storm finally moved east. Frosthaven emerged from the wreckage of winter like a town waking from deep sleep. Roads reopened. Trucks returned. The world resumed its noise. But inside the cabin, everything still revolved around the quiet rhythm of a tiny life learning how to remain. At the end of the second week, Lyra stepped onto the porch for the first time. The world beyond the door was blindingly white. Snow blanketed the pines, the hills, the narrow road that wound into the forest. The air was sharp and clean, cold enough to steal breath. Lyra froze. Her body stiffened, ears flattening. Her heart raced against Elias's palm. He knelt beside her, placing his coat around her shoulders. "You're safe," he said softly. "I'm here." She did not move. A distant truck passed on the highway, its low rumble echoing through the valley. Lyra flinched, pressing against his leg. Elias stayed there with her until the sound faded and her breathing slowed. Then, inch by inch, she lowered her nose to the porch and sniffed. She sneezed. Elias laughed out loud before he could stop himself. The sound startled her. She looked up at him, head tilting, ears twitching. And for the first time, her tail moved. Just once. A tiny, uncertain sweep against the blanket. Elias felt something inside him fracture and mend at the same time. 3 days later, Lyra's temperature spiked. It came without warning. She refused food. Her gums turned pale. Her body shook beneath his hands. Elias did not hesitate. He wrapped her in towels, carried her to the cruiser, and drove through the falling dusk back toward the clinic, tires hissing against fresh snow. The waiting room was nearly empty. The storm had driven most people indoors. Dr. Klein was already preparing the treatment room when Elias burst through the door. Blood tests confirmed what she feared: infection. Her system, already fragile, was fighting too many battles at once. "She's slipping," Dr. Klein said quietly. "But we're not done yet." They placed Lyra under heat lamps, started new fluids, adjusted medication. Elias stood at the glass wall, hands pressed together, heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. Night fell. Time slowed. The storm returned in the early hours, snow sweeping across the windows in heavy waves. At 3 a.m, Lyra stirred. Her eyes opened, dull with exhaustion but burning with something fierce. She lifted her head and pushed it weakly against Elias's wrist through the opening in the treatment chamber. The vet nurse whispered, "She's making a choice." Elias bent close. "You fight," he told her, his voice breaking. "I've got you now." Her ears twitched. By dawn, Lyra was still alive, still fragile, still fighting, still here. The second dawn after Lyra's collapse arrived wrapped in silence. Frosthaven lay beneath a quilt of untouched snow, the mountains crouched low against the pale sky like ancient guardians. Elias Mercer had not left the clinic since the night before. He sat in the narrow chair beside the wall, his coat folded across his lap, his hands clasped as if he could hold the world steady by sheer will alone. His eyes were raw from exhaustion, his body stiff with cold and waiting. Through the glass of the treatment room, Lyra lay motionless beneath the warming lights. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, stubborn movements. The IV dripped its measured promise of survival. Each drop felt like a negotiation with fate. Dr. Hannah Klein moved quietly across the floor, checking the monitors. Her auburn hair loosened now, strands escaping from its tie. She paused beside Elias. "Her temperature is stabilizing," she said. "The antibiotics are working. We caught the infection early enough." Elias exhaled for what felt like the first time in days. "But," she added gently, "she's still extremely weak. She'll need weeks of rest and constant care. This winter is not done testing her." "I'll do it," Elias said at once. Dr. Klein met his eyes. "I know." By afternoon, the storm thinned into drifting flakes. The roads reopened slowly. Animal control returned with the updated paperwork, converting Lyra's status from emergency hold to formal foster placement. Elias signed the final page with a hand that did not tremble this time. That evening, Lyra was cleared to leave the clinic again. Wrapped in fresh blankets, her body warm but fragile, she was placed carefully in Elias's arms. She weighed slightly more than she had the week before, but she still felt like something the wind might steal if he loosened his grip. The drive back to the cabin felt different, not rushed, not frantic, still cautious but threaded now with something like hope. Outside, Frosthaven's lights shimmered beneath the falling snow. Storefronts glowed, cars crept through intersections, the town breathing again after the storm's long hold. And inside the cruiser, a tiny German shepherd puppy slept against Elias's chest, her breath warm and steady. The cabin greeted them with the smell of pine and ash. Elias laid Lyra on the thick blanket he had prepared near the fireplace. He kept the fire burning low and steady, the way Dr. Klein had instructed, careful not to let the heat rise too quickly. He knelt beside her, his hand resting lightly on her back, feeling the faint strength returning beneath her fur. For the first time since he had found her, he allowed himself to believe she might truly stay. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm. Morning, medication, fluids, tiny meals spooned with patience. Midday, rest, warmth, checking temperature. Evening, more food, more water, gentle cleaning of her injured paws. Night. Elias sleeping on the floor beside her, waking at every shift of her breathing. The cabin, once a place of careful solitude, became something else entirely. It learned new sounds, the soft lap of water in a bowl, the rustle of blankets, the small huff of a dreaming puppy. It learned new light, firelight reflecting in dark eyes, the glow of morning snow through frost-laced windows. It learned warmth, not only from flame, but from presence. By the third day, Lyra lifted her head on her own when Elias entered the room. By the fifth, she pushed herself upright for several seconds before sinking back down. On the seventh morning, she stood and did not fall. Her legs shook, her body leaned heavily into Elias's knee, but she remained on her feet. The moment felt so fragile, so impossibly important, that Elias found himself unable to breathe. "That's it," he whispered. "That's it." Lyra's ears twitched, her tail flicked once. He laughed, a quiet sound, thick with disbelief. The world outside this cabin continued its winter march. Snow fell in gentle layers. The forest creaked beneath ice. Frosthaven moved through its days with the steady resilience of mountain people. And inside the small wooden house on the edge of town, a life was being rebuilt one careful hour at a time. 2 weeks into her recovery, Elias opened the front door and let the cold air spill inside. Lyra froze. The scent of snow, pine, and distant smoke flooded the room. The brightness outside made her blink. She took one cautious step forward and stopped. Elias knelt beside her, draping his coat around her thin shoulders. "You don't have to go far," he said. "Just look." Lyra leaned against him, her body trembling, her nose twitching as she tested the world. A truck rumbled somewhere beyond the trees. She flinched, pressing closer. They stayed there until the sound passed and her breathing slowed. Then, slowly, she stepped onto the porch. Snow crunched beneath her paws. Her ears lifted. Her eyes widened. She sneezed hard. Elias laughed out loud. Lyra startled, then studied him. Her head tilted. The tension in her body softened. Her tail moved. Not once. Not twice. But 3 uncertain, fragile sweeps. Elias sat on the porch beside her until the cold numbed his hands, watching the tiny shepherd explore the edge of her world. That night, Lyra slept without trembling. The third week arrived with brighter mornings and thinner storms. Lyra's appetite improved. Her coat began to regain its sheen. The raw skin of her paws healed under careful treatment. She followed Elias from room to room on unsteady legs, determined not to be left behind. And then, just as the cabin had learned to breathe, winter tested them again. It happened near dusk. Lyra refused her food. Her body grew hot beneath Elias's hands. Her eyes dulled, her breathing shallow. He recognized the signs instantly. Fear closed around his chest. He wrapped her in blankets and carried her to the cruiser. The sky darkened, snow returned, the road glistened with ice. At the clinic, Dr. Klein met him at the door. Blood work confirmed what Elias already feared. Her immune system was still fragile, and the infection was fighting back. They placed Lyra under heat lamps again, new fluids, adjusted medication. The familiar sounds of machines returned. Elias sat beside the glass, unmoving. Hours passed. The storm outside thickened. Then, near 3 a.m, Lyra stirred. Her eyes opened. She lifted her head and pressed her muzzle weakly against Elias's wrist through the opening of the chamber. The nurse whispered, "She's making a choice." Elias bent close, his voice barely sound. "You fight. I'm here." Her ears twitched, and the night, for the second time, did not take her. The storm returned as if the mountains themselves had decided not to release her yet. Snow fell thick and fast over Frosthaven, smothering the world in a white silence so heavy it pressed against the chest. The wind came screaming out of the trees, twisting itself around the small veterinary clinic until the windows rattled and the lights inside flickered. Elias Mercer stood in the hallway outside the treatment room, his coat still dusted with snow, his hands locked together as if he could keep the night from breaking her by holding on hard enough. Lyra lay inside beneath the lamps, her small body wrapped in warmth, her chest rising in shallow, stubborn breaths. The infection had returned without warning, surging through a system that was still too fragile from everything winter had already taken from her. The numbers on the monitor flickered like a failing promise. Dr. Hannah Klein moved with quiet urgency between machines, her voice calm but taut. "Her temperature's climbing," she said, "her heart rate's unstable. We're adjusting the fluids." Elias nodded, though the words barely reached him. He had lived with danger for most of his adult life. He had learned how to remain steady when others fell apart. But this was different. This was not something he could control. This was waiting. Hours passed in slow, aching pieces. The waiting room was nearly empty. A young couple came in with a limping husky, faces pale with worry, then disappeared into another wing. A rancher in a snow-caked coat paced the far wall, muttering into his phone. And Elias remained in the same chair, his eyes never leaving the door that separated him from the smallest life he had ever tried to protect. At midnight, the storm worsened. Snow buried the roads again. The radio crackled with warnings about closures on the mountain pass. Elias rose and walked outside, needing air that didn't smell of antiseptic and fear. The parking lot was nearly invisible beneath the blowing white. He stood there, snow settling on his hair and shoulders, and looked up at the sky that offered no stars, only motion. He thought of his brother, of the accident years ago on that same pass, of the night he had learned how quickly winter could take everything. He had built his life since then on control and distance, on the belief that caring too deeply invited loss. Now here he was, praying over a 4-month-old puppy the storm had nearly claimed. When he went back inside, Dr. Klein was waiting. "She's slipping," the veterinarian said quietly. "We're doing everything we can." Elias's throat closed. He nodded once. The nurse adjusted the oxygen. The IV pump clicked. Lyra's breathing grew shallower. Time slowed to a crawl. Then sometime after 3 a.m, the world shifted. Lyra stirred. It was almost imperceptible at first. A twitch of her ear, a faint movement beneath the blanket. Elias was on his feet instantly, pressing closer to the glass. Her eyes opened, not wide, not bright, but open. She lifted her head barely an inch and pressed her small muzzle against Elias's wrist through the opening of the chamber. The nurse's voice trembled. "She's responding." Dr. Klein leaned close, watching the monitor. "She's choosing to fight." Elias bent down, his forehead touching the glass. His voice broke. "I'm here, Lyra. You don't have to do this alone." Her ears twitched. Her tail moved, just the faintest shadow of motion. Outside, the storm still raged. But inside the clinic, something had changed. By dawn, Lyra was still alive. Her numbers were fragile, her body exhausted. But the infection had slowed. The fluids were holding. The fever was receding. Elias had not left his seat. When the first pale light filtered through the windows, Dr. Klein approached him again. She carried a clipboard in her hands. "She made it through the worst of it," the veterinarian said. "If she continues to stabilize today, she'll be able to leave tonight." Elias swallowed hard. "With me?" Dr. Klein smiled. "With you." The day crept forward, measured in heartbeats and test results. The storm finally began to fade, the clouds lifting just enough for Frosthaven's mountains to appear again, sharp and white against the sky. Late that evening, Lyra was cleared for discharge. They wrapped her in fresh blankets and placed her into Elias's arms. She felt warmer now, heavier, more real. As he carried her out into the quiet night, he realized something he had not allowed himself to consider until now. This was no longer temporary. Back at the cabin, the fire was already burning. Elias laid Lyra on the thick blanket near the hearth. She stirred, her nose twitching as she breathed in the scent of wood smoke and home. Elias sat on the floor beside her, watching the rise and fall of her chest. "You scared me," he whispered. Lyra opened her eyes. For the first time, they looked clear. Her tail swept the blanket once, and in that small movement, Elias knew winter had failed to take her. 6 weeks later, the mountains of Frosthaven stood calmer beneath a softer sky. Winter had not vanished, but it had loosened its grip. The snow no longer fell in violent sheets. Instead, it drifted slowly from the pale clouds like quiet ash from an old fire, settling on pine branches and rooftops with a gentleness that felt almost like forgiveness. Elias Mercer and Lyra stood at the edge of Frosthaven Park just after sunrise. The world shimmered in silver and gold, frost sparkling on the ground, the cold air so clean it felt like breathing for the first time. The park's wide fields stretched open and untouched, framed by dark pines and distant mountains that glowed faint pink in the morning light. Lyra hesitated. She was no longer the broken creature Elias had carried from the parking lot weeks before. Her black and tan coat had filled out, glossy and thick against the cold. Her legs, once thin and trembling, were strong now, though still awkward with youth. Her ears, too large for her head, twitched constantly, catching every sound of the waking world. Elias unclipped her leash and held his breath. For a moment she did not move. She turned her head and looked back at him. Not with fear. Not with the hollow exhaustion he had first seen in her eyes. With trust. Elias knelt and tapped his thigh. "Go on, girl." Lyra took one step, then another. Her paws slipped on the thin crust of snow, her body wobbling. She nearly fell, then caught herself and kept going. Her walk turned into a crooked trot. The trot became something close to a run. Lyra ran, not gracefully, not fast, but with every ounce of her small heart. She made a wide, clumsy circle around Elias, her tail swinging wildly, her breath puffing white in the air, her paws kicking up tiny clouds of powder. She stumbled once and rolled sideways, then scrambled up again, completely unbothered, as if the ground itself could not convince her to stop. Elias laughed. He laughed the way he had not laughed in years, loud and unrestrained, the sound echoing across the empty field. Lyra skidded to a halt in front of him and collapsed against his legs, her tongue lolling, her chest heaving, her eyes shining brighter than the snow around them. Elias knelt in front of her and pressed his forehead to hers. "I thought I saved you," he whispered. "Turns out, you saved me first." Lyra's tail thumped against the ground. Later that morning, they drove into town for the final appointment. The Frosthaven Rescue Center was a small building near the edge of the highway, its windows decorated with faded posters of animals who had once needed someone and found them. The volunteers greeted Elias and Lyra with warm smiles and quiet pride. They had followed Lyra's progress from the beginning, from the moment Elias had reported the abandoned puppy during the storm. Today was belonging day, as they called it. The adoption paperwork lay waiting on the desk. Elias sat in the chair, Lyra at his feet, her head resting against his knee. The room smelled of coffee, pine cleaner, and the soft chaos of many lives crossing paths. He signed his name slowly, carefully. Lyra Mercer. When the last page was finished, a volunteer knelt and fastened a new collar around Lyra's neck. Deep green, silver tag, Lyra, Frosthaven, home. The tag jingled softly. Lyra did not flinch. She leaned closer to Elias instead. Outside, the automatic doors slid open, letting winter's light pour in. A shopping cart rattled across the parking lot, pushed by a man unloading supplies. The sound was sharp and metallic, the same sound that had once frozen her in terror. Lyra stiffened for half a second. Then she pressed against Elias's leg. He placed his hand on her back. "It's okay," she stayed. They went home together. The cabin looked different now. A small bed sat beside the fire. Bowls lined the wall. A basket of toys rested near the door. Lyra circled her bed once, twice, then curled up with a soft sigh, her body finally relaxing completely. Elias opened a drawer and placed the old scrap of paper, the one that had once hung from the shopping cart, inside it. The word Lyra, smudged and fading, would remain there, a relic of the storm that had nearly taken her. That night, as the fire crackled and the wind whispered through the trees, Elias sat at his desk and wrote the final email to the rescue group. Subject: Adoption complete. When he turned off the lamp, Lyra lifted her head and looked at him. "Good night," he said. She closed her eyes. Outside, snow fell quietly. Winter, at last, had learned their names. Sometimes God does not send miracles with thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes he sends them in the form of a frightened little life placed quietly in our path and waits to see if we will turn back. This story reminds us that every act of kindness, no matter how small, can become a miracle in someone else's life and often in our own. When Elias chose not to walk away, he became part of God's work of healing a broken soul, and in doing so, his own heart was healed as well. In our daily lives, we are given moments like this every day, a chance to care, a chance to forgive, a chance to help a stranger, a chance to choose love over comfort and fear. Those choices are the true miracles. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what this story meant to you. Subscribe to the channel so more stories of faith, love, and second chances can reach people who are still waiting for their miracle. May God bless every person watching this video. May He protect your family, your home, and your heart. If you believe in miracles and in the power of love, please type Amen in the comments and let your faith be seen.